Good morning, everybody. I'm glad you all could be with us today. Hope you guys had a good spring break for all of our students out there. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Caleb, and I'm one of the pastors here. And if you're new or visiting, we are really glad that you could join us today. And as Joe said, we're walking through the last 3 chapters of Luke. And so we're kind of focusing on Jesus' final days of his life and ministry here. But to frame our thinking today, I wanted to think about how we respond to others says something about us and what we value. So how we respond to other people, other things, other events says something about us and what we value. And that's what we're going to see in our passage today as well, reactions and responses to Jesus and his work. But just to kind of flush this out a little bit, a couple of analogies for us. First is performance reviews. So when I used to work for a bank up in Wisconsin, I would get biannual performance reviews. So every 6 months, my boss and I would meet, and we'd talk about, here are the things you're doing well, here are the things you need to do better in, and that type of thing, right? Pretty standard for any job. And how I responded to her feedback would say something to her about me. And so if I was defensive about something she was giving me feedback on, that would tell her that either I'm insecure about my abilities in this job or that I don't value her feedback, right? Those are the 2 things that really communicates to her. So my response to her feedback tells her something about me. And then also as another example, we have this whole genre of videos called reaction videos. So if you spend time on YouTube, this is a whole category that's really popular of videos, right? And so essentially, if you're unfamiliar, it's just watching a video of a person watching a video and responding to it, right? And that sounds so absurd when you say it that way, but that's exactly what it is. And so this is something that's very common in our culture. And I think that shows us that we really care about how people respond to who we are and what we do. And the whole point of these videos, right, is that they look for content that is controversial or really makes a big statement or is absurd. And so they get a bigger response from the person doing the response in the video and from you as the person watching the video of the other video. And so what we see is how we react, how we respond to other people and other things tells others something about us and what we value. And today, what we're going to focus on is how people respond to Jesus. How do they respond to his ministry, what he does, and what his identity is? And that tells us something about who those people are, and it will tell us something about where we are as well in our reaction to Jesus. So that is what we're going to be focusing on today in Luke. So we'll be in Luke chapter 23 today, picking up in verse 26. And if you're using the Bibles in front of you, it'll be page 884 or 830 if you have one of the smaller ones. So 884 or 830 in the small ones. And it will also be up on the screen. And so for context, Jesus' trial has just finished. He's just gone back and forth with the government, back and forth between Pilate and Herod, and then essentially he is now being sent away to his crucifixion. So Luke chapter 23 will be starting in verse 26. And Luke says this, "And as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, 'Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?'" And we will stop there. You could label this section of Jesus and these women's interaction as the woe, the W-O-E, okay, the woe. And so this is not necessarily a word we use very often, but basically it means that Jesus is saying something really sad, something really difficult and painful is going to come to you. And so that is what Jesus' response is here. And this section starts with Jesus trying to carry his cross, but eventually he is physically unable to do this. And this makes a lot of sense, okay? When Jesus was in the council, with the Jewish council, he was beaten there. So that's the start of his day there. And so then after that, Jesus was also whipped or scourged by the Romans, which oftentimes would kill people in and of itself. And so those two things are happening. Jesus was also very probably sleep deprived as well. And to add on to this, that he has the emotional toll of one of his best friends, Peter, turning his back on him. So Jesus is definitely worn out on a physical level here. That this has been a long, painful day for him. And so it makes a lot of sense that Jesus would not be able to carry this. And so the Romans, what they do is they say, okay, we'll make this Simon of Cyrene guy carry it for him. So in these days, the Romans could pretty much ask a regular citizen to do whatever they wanted, assuming it wasn't illegal. That was their right, and you had to do it, or you also could be put to death as well. And so they enlist this guy, Simon of Cyrene, who we know almost nothing about other than he's from Cyrene, which is in modern-day Libya. And he was probably of Jewish descent because there's a large Jewish population in Cyrene at this time. And that's pretty much all that we know about this character. But he's highlighted here in Luke's account as a guy who helps Jesus out by carrying the cross. But in the midst of this, we see that there's a large following of Jesus to his execution, that this is becoming a big event. Many, many people are there to see it. They want to see Jesus die. But in this crowd of people, there's a group of women who actually feel sorry for Jesus. They are sad about Jesus' death, and they are weeping for him. And they actually have an appropriate response to Jesus' death. But Jesus' response to them is really kind of confusing at first glance, right? Because, this is a pretty appropriate response, right? Jesus is about to die, and they feel sad for him. That is a normal thing to feel, a normal thing to do. But Jesus says, no, don't feel bad for me. Don't cry for me. Don't weep for me in this situation. And he's not just being rude, okay? That's not what's happening here. But what he is saying is that I know the plan that God has, that him and the Father have this plan. And part of this plan is his death, that he knows this is what he's supposed to be doing. And he tells his disciples multiple times, this is what's going to happen to me. So this isn't like some sort of surprise happening to Jesus, but it is the plan from the beginning of time that this is what's going to happen. And Jesus is saying, don't feel bad for me because this needs to happen. This is what must happen to me. And so he has confidence in the plan of him and God the Father. But we also see here Jesus prophesies to these ladies. He tells them what is going to happen. And the interesting thing in Luke is that Jesus not once but 3 times talks about the fall of Jerusalem here. And you could potentially make an argument for 4 times. This is a theme that comes up multiple times in Luke's account. In chapter 9 and chapter 14, Luke talks about the fall of Jerusalem and the pain that will come as a result of the rejection of Jesus. That is why this is going to happen. This is why these painful things will come about. It's because of their rejection of Jesus. And what Jesus does is he uses Hosea 10:8, a book from the Old Testament, a prophecy about judgment that will come upon the Old Testament people of God because they reject the one true God and they start worshiping idols. And that is why judgment is coming on them. And so Jesus is saying in the same way that those people deserve judgment back then, you now deserve judgment, the people broadly speaking, because you have rejected me, because I am God. You're rejecting me, you're rejecting God. And so you too will see the judgment that comes from rejection of God. And so he's making this analogy with Hosea. And what we know about prophecy is that we should judge the prophecy based on if it actually happens. And what we will see later on in history in 70 AD is that Rome will come up against a Jewish revolt in Jerusalem, and they will absolutely crush it. All right, they will destroy all the walls, they will utterly decimate the temple, and they will dominate the Jewish people in this area. And these things were never rebuilt after this happened. And so they completely follow through with Jesus' prophecy here. So we see that this comes true. And so we see Jesus is continuing to prophesy. He's continuing to live out his mission, although it's not necessarily a cheery one in this case. But he's continuing to live out his mission and prophesy as he's even walking to his death. But finally, I think Jesus kind of ends this with a weird riddle-like statement. He says, like the green wood and the dry wood. And what is he talking about there? Especially upon first reading, you might say, what are you talking about, Jesus? This is so weird that you're talking about this in this context. But I think what Jesus is doing here is he is making an analogy to firewood, all right? And so if you think about firewood, you need to age it so that way it burns properly. Because if you don't age the wood, it won't light very easily and it'll take forever. And so the green wood is like the wood that has been recently cut. It is still alive. It still has some of the leaves on it. That's the type of imagery that Jesus is providing. Whereas the dry wood has obviously been aged and the moisture has gone from it, so it'll burn very easily. And so what I think Jesus is saying here is he's saying that if this is what's happening to me, the green wood, the living wood, and God is allowing me to die in this way, think about how much more easily the judgment of God will come upon people who actually deserve it, the dry wood who has been aging and building up their sin. And so Jesus is saying, if this is what God is allowing to happen to me, then just imagine what is going to happen to the people who reject Jesus, the one true God. And so he's saying, he's making the analogy of judgment and the burning aspect of it. And so the firewood that burns easily deserves the judgment because it is built up for itself, whereas Jesus, the living wood, does not deserve the judgment. So Jesus here makes this analogy. And then what we see is that he says, do not weep for me. He makes the analogy, and then he kind of closes this section for us. And so we see one response to Jesus is the lamenting, and these women may not fully understand Jesus' purpose here as he's going to his death. But this isn't the only reaction we'll see today. We'll see several other reactions from different groups of people. So let's pick up in verse 32. And Luke says, 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots to divide his garments. And the people stood by watching, but the rulers scoffed at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself. If he is the Christ of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, This is the King of the Jews. One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. And we'll pause there. And what we see in this section is the mocking of Jesus, that this is the response of 3 groups of people. They all chose to mock Jesus and reject him and his identity and his work. And as we're seeing this mocking, what we see is Luke really is brief in his account of the physical crucifixion, right? He basically just says they take Jesus outside the city limits, outside the walls, and then after that, they put Jesus up on the cross, and then they put up 2 guys right beside him. And that's basically his description of the process of crucifixion. And so from Luke leaving out any other information, this tells us that his audience was very familiar with this process, that he doesn't have to go to the lengths to describe what is going on because they already understand it. And something that we should remember as we read this portion is that in our context, we tend to think of crucifixion solely with Jesus, because that we don't really see people crucified that often. But in Luke's day, what we see is that this is a common thing. This is not something that is that abnormal. They were familiar with it. They'd probably seen it before. And so Luke's audience was familiar with this, unlike our context. And that's just something to remember, that Jesus received an execution of a common criminal in that way. And so he became dishonored for our honor. And that is a good thing to remember in this process. But what we see as in Luke's brief description, he focuses more time on the people mocking than Jesus actually being hung on the tree there. He spends much, much more time on the people mocking. And I think what it would be helpful is to consider the different groups of people that are mocking Jesus and what are they saying about him. And the first group of people that we see is the people and the leaders, okay? And by the people, it doesn't just mean everybody, but I think he means the Jewish people specifically here. And then also their leaders. So the people who conspired against Jesus, the people who said to Judas, hey, we're going to go and we're going to arrest him. Can you help us do this? And then the people who brought him to Pilate. Those are the type of people we're talking about here. The people who called for Jesus over Barabbas, the criminal. The people who wanted Jesus to be unjustly killed. That's who we're talking about here. And their taunt to Jesus is that he should save himself. And there's so many layers to this taunt that they give him, right? On one level, if it were me, part of my thought process is, okay, why would you choose to mock this guy? Because these are probably people who have seen some of Jesus' miracles, whether it's healing people, casting out demons, or even heard about with the disciples how Jesus has controlled the weather, controlled the waves. And if someone has that kind of resume, why would you mock them even if they're in the process of being executed? Doesn't seem like a smart idea to me, but hey, I wasn't alive back then, so I wasn't there. But that's one level to this. They're mocking a man who has quite the resume. But on the other hand, what we see is that there is an irony to their statement of calling Jesus to save himself. That the reality is that Luke's readers know that it is only through Jesus' death that we can receive life. And it shows these people's complete misunderstanding and rejection of Jesus because they are calling for him to save himself. That they don't understand that actually this is the plan of God for Jesus to die. That it is only through Jesus' pain and suffering that ultimately the follower of Jesus can have true life. So it is an ironic statement by the people and the Jewish leaders here. But this isn't the only group we have. We also have the Roman soldiers. The Roman soldiers mocked Jesus quite a bit. And with them, what we see is that they are probably the ones we would expect to make fun of Jesus. Okay, these are battle-hardened, veteran type of guys who may not have the most politically correct sense of humor. That's the type of guy we got here. And so they may have seen Jesus as a potential threat, whether legitimate or not, of causing an insurrection or a rebellion. And so they may have said, well, even if he is or not, it might as well just be good to get rid of him so that way we don't have to fight a war, we can go back home to our families, all that type of thing. So this is not necessarily a surprise here. But we see that the Roman soldiers, their mocking of Jesus is steeped in sarcasm, right? So what we see is that they are the ones who put up this sign that says, Jesus, King of the Jews, and they did this in 3 languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, so that way no matter who you were or where you were from, you could read their taunt about Jesus. And so they are saying mockingly, because Pilate told them to do so, that you are the king. So they're obviously not actually acknowledging that Jesus is king, but they're making fun of him, saying, look, the king is upon his throne. And so that is one level of sarcasm. But we also see that these men provide Jesus with some vinegar and wine mixture, very common drink in the Roman period, especially for lower class people, cheaper than pure wine, purely financial thing. So very common for these soldiers to drink. But they're mockingly giving this to him and saying, look, we are serving the king. Look at us. Give him this drink and serve him. Again, what we see from the Roman soldiers is sarcasm primarily, that they are mocking Jesus in this way. And then finally, what we see in Luke's account is one of the criminals making fun of Jesus. And he is saying that if you are God's son, if you are the chosen one, if you are the Christ, if you are the Messiah, and you can save all these other people, why don't you save yourself? And I think what we see from this man is bitterness and anger to his situation. Because if anyone is really that sympathetic to Jesus, it should be someone who's suffering in a similar way to him, right? This man is also about to die in the exact same way that Jesus is. And what does he choose to do with his final breaths? To make fun of a guy who's dying the same way he is. And it just shows his anger and his bitterness to Jesus and his absolute rejection of who he is. So in all three of these groups of people, we see the response of mocking Jesus, the response of rejecting Jesus. And what we really see is that these people not only didn't like Jesus, they actually hated him. These are the actions of people that are filled with hate, not with people that just disagree on an intellectual level with Jesus, right? You're not going to continually kick a man while he's down unless you truly hate him. And that is the response we see from these people. But that is not the end of our text for today. We will also see a different response to Jesus. And so we'll pick up in verse 40. But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." And that is the end of our section for today. And this is really, like I said earlier, a different response to Jesus, a different response to him. And this is the main positive response we see to Jesus in this section. Someone who actually knows and acknowledges Jesus' identity and work here. He knows that Jesus is actually the king. He's saying, when you go into your kingdom, an acknowledgement and an implication that Jesus actually is the king. He trusts Jesus. He says, when you enter into your kingdom, will you help me out? Will you let me go with you? And Jesus says, yes, he trusts fully that Jesus is the one who can intercede for his sins. He acknowledges his own guilt. He says, I deserve this. I knew what I did was wrong, but I know that Jesus is the one who can help me out. He acknowledges, he has faith in Jesus. And this is the positive response. The response that Jesus demands is faith. And what we also notice in this section is that this criminal is one of the few people to positively respond to Jesus. And often the people who are positively responding to Jesus are not necessarily the people we would think. It's not necessarily the religious leaders. It is not people in the government. It is not people well respected by society. These are not typically the followers of Jesus in Luke's account. What we see is it's the criminals, like this man on the cross. It is the disciples, just everyday guys who are fishermen, tax collectors, okay? It's tax season. We don't like taxes, right? So people who are hated by many. And so what we see is that these are the people who are following Jesus. People from diverse backgrounds are following him. And they're connected by this positive response to Jesus, that their faith in him is what combines people. No matter their ethnicity, background, career, or anything, they're all united in him and how they respond to Jesus. And that is our primary identity when we become a part of the kingdom, like this criminal is acknowledging, that our primary identity is in Jesus and how we have faith in him. And so we see a different response to Jesus. So what do we take away from this? We see these two different responses from multiple different people. But how do we then take this and say, man, how do I follow Jesus better? Or how do I do something with this information? Because we don't want to just be hearers, we want to be doers of the word. And I think the first thing we should do is say, what is your response to Jesus and the cross he offers you? What is your response to Jesus and the cross he offers you? And what we see in this passage is that there's only two responses to Jesus. We are either with the mockers, the people that hate him, or we are with the criminal who say, I trust in you, Jesus. Those are our two options. There's no middle ground. There's no sitting on the fence with Jesus. You are either with him or you are not with him. Those are the two options we are given, and this text shows us an example of that. And the reality is our default position is that with the mockers, that we're all born disobeying God, seeking our own way, and rebelling against him, rejecting God's design for us. That's our default position when we come into this world. And we need someone to intercede for us on our behalf with God. And Jesus is the only one who can do this. And this criminal acknowledges that, and he understands that even in his brief interaction with Jesus here. He understands that Jesus is the one who can get him into the kingdom, that he is the one who can pay the price for his sins, because he knows he's messed up. He's there rightfully. And what we see is that this positive response is ultimately trust in Jesus. And although this man didn't have a long life after his trust in Jesus, he did fully trust him and had faith that it was Jesus who was the only one who could save him. So we must first have faith. That is the initial response. But faith isn't just something that we say, a little prayer one time and then we're saved. That's not what we're about. But what we're about is just every day saying, hey, Jesus, I want to follow you. I want to trust in you. Not that we need to be saved every day, but that faith is a continual trust and reliance upon God. And that each day we too must choose to bear our cross that God has given us, right? That is what discipleship is. It's picking up our cross daily. And so Jesus here is living that out, right? He picks up the cross for as long as he can, and he also sits on the cross as long as he can till he dies. And so Jesus is giving us an example. He is discipling us in his actions that we too must continue to have faith and trust God's plan despite the circumstances and what's going on. So we need to pick up our cross, trust God daily and have faith daily and continually say, I'm going to continue to live this out in response to Jesus and what he's done. Second, we need to see Jesus' power and control. Right? We trust in Jesus' power and control even. So even when Jesus is walking to his death, he is still powerful. He is still in control here. And what we see is that Jesus knows this is the plan from God all along. He's told us that earlier, and he walks up with this confidence. Yes, there was stress. Yes, there was a toll taken on him, but he ultimately is confident in what God is doing. He knows the plan. He is a part of the plan, and he will carry it out because he is in control. He's not just letting himself be ruled by emotion or difficulty. He is absolutely in control. And I think it can be easy for us to fixate on details and little minor things that we don't see the bigger picture that God may be doing. Right? We tend to say, how could God allow this thing to happen in this circumstance? And we don't ask the question, what could God be doing in the bigger picture in our lives? And I don't say that to minimize pain or difficulty, because we all have difficult things that are happening, and probably many of us walked in here with difficult things happening in our lives. But I say that because, at least in my experience, that is our initial response to say, how could God allow this to happen? But we need to move that to the bigger picture. Maybe there's something that God is doing through this thing that he's allowing in my life. Now, there's plenty of reasons why God could be allowing this. The Bible tells us it could be our own sin. It could be the sin of others. Or it could be that God's allowing this suffering to teach us something about who he is. And we don't necessarily know which reason it is. God doesn't guarantee us an answer as to why things are happening. But the consistent witness of the entire Bible, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, is that when things are going wrong, when things are difficult, the proper response is to lean more into God and not lean away from him. And what we see is that at the end of the day, whether this life or the next, everything will be made right. And we even see that as an example on the cross, right? That either all sin will be paid for on the cross by Jesus or by the person in eternity apart from God. And so all sin will get its just punishment because God is in control. What we know about Jesus is that he ultimately will be the king. He is the judge. He is a perfect judge who judges justly, and he is powerful and in control. And part of this process is the crucifixion. And we'll talk more about that in the resurrection and the ascension and the power of Jesus. But what we see in this passage is that Jesus doesn't doubt the plan. He sticks to the plan. He's in control. And despite his hanging on the cross, he still has power. Finally, what we need to do is in our suffering, we should hold on to our future hope. In our suffering, we should hold on to our future hope. And this is exactly what Jesus says to the criminal on the cross. That he can trust Jesus, that because Jesus is in control, because he has that power, he can guarantee to this criminal that he will spend eternity with Jesus in paradise, where there is no more suffering, where there is no more pain, where there are no more tears. And so he tells this criminal, this is what you have to look forward to, and I can guarantee that. And so in these moments where you're suffering up on the cross, this is what you can look forward to. And so as Christians, if we have faith in Jesus, this too is what we have to look forward to. We have the ability to look forward to this eternity in paradise spent with King Jesus. Now, I want to be careful when I say that because there is an appropriate level of this as well. Sometimes we get so forward focused that we miss out on the here and now. That God has stuff for us to do here and now. He has ministries for all of us who are Christians in our lives and the people around us. And so the tendency on the one hand can be to focus so much on the future, so much on this hope we have in heaven, that we forget what's going on and what God has for us here and now. And I don't want us to make that mistake. I want us to say this at an appropriate time. Notice how Jesus brings this up in his suffering. Yes, it's appropriate to look forward to, but we don't want to just every time we hang out, just say, man, I hope God takes me now so I get to spend eternity in heaven with him, right? That shouldn't be what we're doing every time we hang out, right? That's not appropriate. But the other ditch to fall in is that we get so stuck on the here and now and all these details, and we're like so worried about everything that we forget at all about our future hope. And what Jesus says is, no, we must remember our future hope. That when things get hard, this is what we can cling to. That at the end of the day, because of our faith in Jesus, we have this paradise with him to look forward to, where there is no more sin, where there is no more pain, where there is no crying or anything like that. And so Jesus says, in these times of suffering, we individually need to remember it, and we corporately also need to remember it. That when we are struggling with these things, we need our friends in Christ to say, hey, remember your future hope, that you have this guarantee from the King that you will be a part of his kingdom. And so we should not and cannot forget the hope that we have as a result of Jesus' suffering and death, that we have a future hope to look forward to. So to wrap it up, I just want to say we need to respond to Jesus with faith. That's important. We need to respond to Jesus in faith. Pick up our cross daily. In good times, in bad times, we need to trust in Jesus' power and control. And finally, we need to cling to our future hope with Jesus in times of suffering. Let's pray. God, we thank you for giving us your word. We thank you, Jesus, for the suffering that you were willing to go through and for your confidence in the plan that you and the Father have together, that you were in control, that you weren't worried about all the little details, but you stuck to the plan, and even though it was hard, you did it anyway. We thank you for that and your suffering for us, because we know that it is only through your pain, your suffering, and your death that we can have life. And so as we go out of here today, I want us to remember that how we respond to you daily matters, that we would continually seek to bear our cross daily and have faith in you, that is really what is life-giving and fulfilling in our lives, is picking up our cross daily and following you. And I pray for anybody here today that is suffering and in hard times, that they could look to this future hope that they have in you, that they would see this future in paradise that they have as a guarantee from you, the King of the perfect kingdom. So we just pray as we go out of here that we would cling to that in times of suffering. And we thank you, Jesus, for all that you are willing to do for us. Amen. All right, go ahead and stand up as we sing these last two songs.